Hello everyone, today I want to talk about dual booting. We're going to be talking about what it is for those of you who may not know, and we'll also talk about some of the benefits, the negatives, and overall what the use cases are for it. Technically, dual booting isn't the correct term for it, it would be called multi-booting, but most of the time people only need 2 operating systems, but it is possible to do as many as you want as long as you have enough storage for it. But we'll be calling it dual booting because that's the most common use case, and it's what most people reference it as. So to start off, what is dual booting? And to put it simply, it is having 2 operating systems on the same computer. And doing this has a couple of benefits. The first one being obviously that you can run different software designed for different operating systems all on the same machine. For example, there's some things that run better on Linux, like if you're doing things like Android modification with ADB, or managing a bunch of terminals over things like SSH. A lot of the more technical things run better on Linux than they do on Windows, whereas Windows has other benefits like better maintained graphics drivers, general support for popular software, and overall just needing less troubleshooting to make work. And by booting both of them on the same computer, you can get the benefits of both at the same time without needing a separate computer. Another great use case for dual booting is separating different personas. For example, if you do work on your own personal computer, you'll probably find it getting pretty muddy separating the work stuff and your personal stuff. But with dual booting, you could essentially run a separate operating system for your work stuff from your personal things, and then everything is nice and separated. And whenever you are working, you're kind of in work mode because you're using essentially a work computer just installed on your PC. I actually have a similar setup to this for my PC, where I'm running Linux Mint as my primary operating system. But because DaVinci Resolve doesn't do a great job of supporting Linux, I also have a smaller Windows partition that I use to edit my videos for YouTube. Then to get the files across, I have a data hard drive, and it is formatted in a format that both of the operating systems can read from, which makes for a very smooth workflow where I can essentially record up everything I want to, and then reset the PC and boot up Windows and start doing my editing from there. However, for a lot of people, they might be struggling to find a use case because they don't want to use Linux, which is by far the most popular form of dual booting, is of course running Linux and Windows on the same computer. So we're going to talk briefly about the perks of Linux in this video, but I actually have an entire video about Linux if you want to see that. I'll make sure it's linked in the description down below. But basically, in the last year or so, Linux has gotten much more support from software developers, and a lot of things work on it now. For example, things like gaming on Steam or playing Minecraft can all be done on Linux very smoothly. In fact, I actually get better performance on the Linux PC than I did when I was using Windows. Now, it's not perfect, because if you play games that require a kernel level anti-cheat, those tend to not work. But I'm gonna be totally real, I haven't seen a game with a kernel level anti-cheat that I don't fucking hate. So in a way, this is just helping me maintain my mental health by not playing games like Destiny. But as you guys can see in the background gameplay, even some of the less stable games like OG Borderlands 1 with mods even works totally fine on Linux. And I really recently set this up, but the modding scene for Borderlands is awesome. I remember in the past for years, you had to go into the ini files and add a hotkey to change your FOV above 70 if you wanted to have that. And you had to press that hotkey every time you got out of a vehicle, or save quit, or restarted the game. And it made it really annoying to try to play. But with the current generation of SDK mods available for it, the game is amazing. Everything from smoother frame rate, better FOV, a bunch of quality of life like ammo pickups, it's really cool. But yeah, side tangent aside, I find that most of my games end up running better on Linux. And while obviously overall the support on Linux isn't as good as Windows, that's just how it is for now, Windows has been slowly going down the route of corporate enshittification for years now. Windows 11 overall just feels like a UI downgrade to Windows 10. It's got a bunch of unwanted AI slop that's just stuck on by default, and it's actually one of the only operating systems in the world that forces you to sign into it, and otherwise your computer's just a useless brick if you don't. Overall, Linux is going to offer more flexibility and freedom to customize it exactly how you want it to be, and you're also just going to off the bat have a much better privacy, because your computer isn't being loaded up with a bunch of bloatware and spyware from Windows. On top of that, Linux runs a lot leaner than Windows. I just went and took a look at it, and running Windows with literally nothing running requires over 4 gigabytes of memory, whereas running Linux Mint with nothing running has just 1.5 gigabytes of footprint. And while that's not the end of the world on higher end PCs, if you're on a laptop, for example, that only has 4 gigabytes of memory, your Windows is going to run significantly worse than it would on a regular PC, whereas Linux would be basically unaffected by the weaker hardware. So those are some of the reasons to want to use Linux. So now let's get into how dual booting actually works, and how you can start if you're interested in doing it. Dual booting is kind of a beautiful thing because 90% of the hardware in your computer does not care what operating system it's on, it'll just work. The CPU, the GPU, as long as you have drivers for the operating system, the memory, all that just works no matter what's going on. It doesn't care what operating system it's running. The only thing that matters is your storage. You have to dedicate storage to a specific operating system, and these are called partitions. Basically, a partition is a dedicated storage set for a specific operating system. So for example, if you have a hard drive and an SSD, which is a pretty common configuration for a lot of people's gaming PCs, you could run Linux on your SSD, and that way you have all of the games running off the SSD for the faster load times. And then you could run Windows off of the hard drive so that you have all the storage for doing your work and boring stuff with files. In my case, I actually have 2 SSDs. I have a SATA SSD that is pretty small and old now, and I have an NVMe SSD in the M2 slot. I put Linux on the bigger NVMe SSD, then I run Windows on the smaller SATA SSD, and I have a shared data hard drive that both of them are able to access. And these partitions can be set up however you like, and you don't have to dedicate an entire drive to a specific OS. Because partitions can be made on a portion of a storage drive, and you can make as many as you like and run a different OS on each of those partitions. That being said, there can sometimes be some deeper technical issues if you run everything on one drive. Not to mention that generally a storage drive isn't intended for running multiple OSs, and you might just end up not having a lot of storage for each computer. On top of that, if the drive does go bad, then you no longer have an operating system on that computer until you get a new one, and you've effectively lost everything. Whereas if you have multiple drives with different OSs on each one, if one of them goes bad, you still have the other operating system to manage the computer with. So now that we understand the way that dual booting works, let's look at how you can actually do it yourself. The first step is going to be creating a bootable drive, and there are a couple of ways of doing this. 2 of the regular ones are Rufus or Balena Etcher. However, my new favorite and a little bit of a more special way of doing it is called Ventoy. Ventoy is a special form of bootable drive because it essentially is an operating system itself, at least a very minimal one. Basically, the purpose of Ventoy as an operating system is to let you pick other operating system ISOs you have on the disk to boot off of, so that way you can install all the operating systems you want to onto a single bootable drive, and then when you plug it into a computer, you can pick whichever one you want to do. This is especially nice for dual booting because you'll have to create 2 drives if you're not using Ventoy, whereas you could just put both of the OSs you want onto Ventoy and only need 1 drive for it. So that'll be the method I'm using in this video, and I'll leave a link in the description to their website if you're interested in setting it up. You just follow the instructions on their installation page, and you'll be able to drag and drop as many ISOs as you want onto a single bootable drive. From there, you'll want to plug in your bootable drive to the computer you're trying to install an OS on, and you'll need to open up the boot menu. Every computer does this a little bit differently, but you can look at what brand computer or motherboard you have on your computer and search for the key to do this. Basically, while the computer's booting up, you're supposed to press some key to enter the menu to select a boot option. If you don't feel like looking up what key to press, generally it's F9, F10, or F12, or sometimes F2 or the delete key. So you can just kind of... and you'll probably be able to get it right. Once you open up the boot menu for your PC, you'll want to select your bootable drive. Generally, it's called Ventoy, or it references the drive that you're using, like a USB stick or an SD card in my case that I'm just using a USB adapter on. Whatever it is, you'll want to select your bootable drive, and from there Ventoy is going to open up on your computer and give you a little UI where you can pick the operating system you want to install. If you went down the road of using Balena Etcher or Rufus instead, then it's just going to immediately load up whatever OS you assigned it to. And from there, it's very simple. You should have whatever UI the OS you're going for has. For me, I decided to do Linux Mint here, because that is my favorite Windows alternative right now, and it works very well straight out of the box, and the UI is pretty similar for Windows, so it's good for my muscle memory. And after you run through all of the install options, then Linux Mint will be installed. From there, I'd recommend following all the instructions to get it set up, and unplug the USB when it asks you to when you reboot. So I made a little bit of a mistake I figured out about after doing this process, and I don't want to go back and reinstall everything just to show you. Basically, if you plan on dual booting both Windows and Linux on the same storage drive, make sure you create Windows' partition first, because Linux is willing to work with NTFS, which is the file system for Windows, but Microsoft refuses to acknowledge the existence of dual booting, and will not play along if you already have Linux installed on the drive. But other than that, the only other step is to just repeat the process I just did, but set up partitions in a way that allows you to have both operating systems. It's a very flexible system, and you can do a lot with it, especially as you become more advanced. But for something simple, I recommend just having one OS on one drive and another OS on the other. It's very simple, it's hard to break, and it will work really well. But once you've done this, you're almost done with the dual boot setup. The last thing is making it so that your computer asks you which operating system you want to use when you boot it up. Obviously, you don't want to have to mash all the buttons on your keyboard to pick an operating system every time you boot it up. So what I suggest doing is setting the Linux partition to be your primary drive, because pretty much every Linux distro has something called grub for a bootloader, and grub is actually able to open up Windows for you whenever it comes up. So essentially, you'll turn on your computer and you will have Linux set as your primary drive, and it's going to boot into grub, which will then ask you if you want to launch Linux or if you want to launch Windows. And from there, you're able to do it, and everything is set up. To set up the boot priority, you'll have to access the BIOS of your computer, which generally is another hotkey in the list of the F2, F9, F10, and all that. And once again, you can look it up for your computer specifically, or you can just try pressing buttons until it works. Once you get there, you're looking for the boot priority, and you just want to move it to the top. I noticed that in the BIOS, it seems to read Linux Mint as Ubuntu, but it is in fact Linux Mint for me, and Linux Mint is built off of Ubuntu, so that's probably where that's coming from. And with that, we have set up dual booting on our PC, and are on our way to being a tech genius. So thank you all very much for watching to the end of the video, you are much appreciated. But before you go, I just wanted to say, one of my favorite things about doing YouTube is getting to read the comments, so if you have any thoughts or feedback, I would love to hear it down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the future. Bye!